Welcome again to our first K-CAI event, a webinar on evidence for climate action in Europe. Please note that the webinar is recorded, and I'll now hand it over to Claire Walsh, Associate Director of Policy at JPEL Global and K-CAI Project Director.
A warm welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining our first climate change event of 2022, focused on evidence for climate action in Europe. As Tara said, I'm the project director for JPEL's major research and policy initiative focused on climate change, which is called the K-Climate Action Initiative. Next slide, please. And so in the next hour, Tara and I will briefly introduce JPEL, the type of research we do, and how you can engage with us, particularly focused on partnerships and climate change. And then after that, we're so lucky to have two members of the JPEL Research Network, Rob Metcalf and Andrea, who will share their work partnering with private sector partners and government partners to generate evidence on climate change programs and apply it at scale in policy. So Rob is an associate professor of economics at the University of Southern California, and Andreas is chair for environmental and resource economics and sustainability at Ruhr University in Bochum. After that, we'll have Q&A. You can ask any questions you might have about the type of research we do, how it might be useful to you in designing better climate solutions, how you might partner with JPEL to generate some of this research. And then Tara will close highlighting some ways that you can reach out and engage with us if you're interested in starting a collaboration. Next slide, please. And what we hope you take away at the end of the day is a better understanding of what randomized evaluations are and how they can be used to measure the impacts of climate change programs, both on the environment and on people who are disproportionately affected by climate change. We also hope that you understand how evidence by either partnering on one of these studies or using the evidence that's already out there from these studies can help ensure that our climate action is effective. It actually reduces emissions or supports communities disproportionately affected by climate change and adapting. And we hope that you walk away with some understanding of how you can engage with us if you're interested. Next slide, please. So first, a little bit about JPEL. We're a global research center working to ensure that policy is informed by scientific evidence. We started at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the United States, where I'm based, in 2003. But since then, we've grown into a global network of 8 offices around the world and over 260 affiliated professors at over 75 universities worldwide, who work in close partnership with governments, NGOs, companies to conduct randomized evaluations to measure the impact of social and environmental programs on people's lives. And so that's the first main thing we do, which is fund and implement research. We also have expert policy teams that help decision makers apply the insights that we've learned from the research that we've conducted to implement policies that improve people's lives. And then third, we have capacity building teams that support practitioners and decision makers in using these research methods themselves if they're interested, or using evidence from these studies. Next slide. And as I've mentioned before, we have many offices around the world, including a European office based at the Paris School of Economics, which Tara will speak more about soon. And all of these offices are led by staff from these regions who've built long-term partnerships with organizations making change in these regions so that we can design research that's responsive to policymakers and local constituents' priorities. Next slide, please. And our main vehicle for working on climate change is the K-Climate Action Initiative. The K-Climate Action Initiative was launched in 2020, and it's focused on generating and applying evidence that can combat climate change and poverty. And our mission is to innovate, test, and scale evidence-informed climate solutions with decision makers across sectors around the world. And since launching in 2020, We have funded and launched over 30 pilots and randomized evaluations on climate change programs that are happening in the real world, being implemented by governments, NGOs, and firms, and 6 scaling projects that are actually taking evidence-based programs and scaling them up. As you can see, we define climate change quite broadly. So we work, of course, on mitigation and cutting emissions as much as possible, but we also equally work on climate change adaptation, especially for low-income communities, pollution reduction, and energy access. Particularly in Europe, where we prioritize work on mitigation and pollution reduction, and for adaptation, it's focused on low-income communities disproportionately affected by climate change. And what's great about this initiative is that it creates opportunities for JPEL-affiliated professors and their partners to come together to do new research or new policy work together. So we have competitions every 6 months, where teams of implementing partners and JPEL-affiliated researchers apply to us, and through a competitive process, we award funding for pilots, new research, or scaling grants. So that's it for me, and now I'll hand it over to Tara to talk more about our work in Europe.
Thanks, Claire. So as Claire mentioned before, JPEL has 7 regional offices, and I'm speaking to you from our Europe office based at the Paris School of Economics. So as you can see on this map, we work mostly on education and labor markets, with other sectors becoming more and more open and available for evaluations. So far, we've conducted over 90 randomized evaluations of social programs and policies in 21 countries across Europe. And we often work in partnerships with governments, for example, national ministries on social inclusion and education, but also NGOs, government agencies, and of course, also the private sector. An example of a recent climate study was conducted in partnership with the French Interministerial Directorate of Public Transformation to reduce air pollution in homes across France. As you can see, our work in climate is really just at the beginning. So we're really hoping to change that by removing obstacles for both researchers and for implementers, and making impact evaluations accessible through initiatives like K-CAI. But why do we want to evaluate climate action in Europe? So 2 big reasons. First of all, Europe is the 3rd largest CO2 emitting region in the world. And we think that there's a big opportunity here to work on cutting emissions and cutting pollution. Second of all, in Europe, the priorities of governments and citizens are really aligned. So on the government level, Europe takes a leadership role in terms of climate action with the European Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package. But at the same time, citizens really care about these issues as well. Here you can see a study that 96% of Europeans have taken at least one action to tackle climate change. 93% believe that climate change is a serious problem, and 90% believe that greenhouse gas emissions should be reduced to eventually reach climate neutrality. Actions to fulfill all these goals are being led on multiple levels. Individuals, firms, governments, but also cities, communities. But few of these policies and programs have been rigorously evaluated to find out what really works and by how much. And we think Europeans need more evidence on which interventions are effective, both in terms of impact and in terms of cost. We also think that randomized evaluations are a really good tool in figuring this out. So I keep talking about randomized evaluations, and it's time that I explain what they are. So randomized evaluations essentially estimate the causal impact of a program. There are many different types of impact evaluations. You've maybe heard of pre-post analysis, simple difference, difference in difference, regression, statistical matching. Essentially, there are many different ways that researchers try to measure the impact of something. But JPEL does randomized evaluations. Sometimes they're known as randomized control trials, or in short, RCTs. And our affiliated professors and invited researchers specialize in conducting them. In their simplest form, a randomized evaluation will divide a group of individuals or households or companies or even communities into 2 groups. And the key part in this division is that the process is done at random. So the groups are not divided along some characteristic like income levels, so that the groups are on average and statistically the same. In practice, the two groups may be different from each other, but if the group size is large enough, these differences are likely to be unimportant, but that's also something that we test for. Also, through something called power calculations, we can determine how big this group size really has to be so that at the end, we can be confident that the effects that we're seeing are really attributable to the intervention. So we have the two groups, and one of them becomes or gets an intervention, and the other one acts as a comparison. And at the end, we measure outcomes of both groups. And like I said, with a large enough sample, we can have high confidence that we're really measuring the effect or the absence of an effect of that program. It's important to note that the only systematic difference between these two groups is the presence of the program. Now I'll quickly just touch on how we can work together. As Claire explained, K-CAI is an initiative. So what that means is that we offer competitive funding opportunities to our JPEL affiliated researchers and invited researchers to evaluate innovations. Once a researcher from our network is matched to you, an implementing partner, they can apply for funding through our biannual funding cycles, the next of which opens at the end of July and closes in September. The funding is earmarked for the evaluation though, so not for the implementation of the project, not for the technical material, but really for the study. And here on the slide, you can see that there are three main evaluation types that our researchers can provide. Starting in the middle, we have randomized evaluations, which we just learned about. And alternatively, in the left box, we have pilot studies, which is really just a step before a full randomized evaluation. So a pilot study will test a smaller version of the project or policy for its technical and logical feasibility. But on the other hand, on the right box, we have scale projects in which researchers will help you to expand this provenly effective project to a wider audience. And provenly effective in this context means through a randomized evaluation. Not necessarily one that was conducted with JPEL, but a randomized evaluation nonetheless. Here's a partnership timeline. I'm actually going to pull up this slide after our speaker's presentation and walk you through it in detail. But the only thing that I'd like you to keep in mind for now is that we have a funding competition that's opening soon. And now, or this spring, is a great time to get in touch so that I can put you in touch with researchers and we can develop project ideas and apply for funding. So to give you an idea of what this research looks like on the ground, I'll hand it over to our first speaker, Rob Metcalf.
Thank you, Tara. I'll just see the slides okay? Great. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Tara, for having me to chat about some of my research in working with the private sector to understand sort of the policies or projects that we can do to help mitigate climate change. So I think for fuel efficiency, it's quite an interesting area because there are many parts or many industries that use fuel where it's going to be impossible to remove the carbon intensity over time. You could think about aviation, you could think about shipping. Like it's just been very difficult to have any sort of low carbon intensity fuels in the next 10 to 20 years, maybe 30 years, but in the sort of immediate future, it's very difficult. And so trying to understand how do we reduce our impact in these industries, for example, is pretty, it's a pretty first order importance. So we've got more and more data about how these industries or these markets actually use fuel and produce CO2. And so, many companies now have a lot of ESG goals, and they have a lot more data about, the impact on the environment. They have more and more dashboards of, how their carbon intensity or their CO2 emissions or their greenhouse gas emissions are changing. But I think, from the research that we've seen, both in these sort of, fuel intensive industries, but also outside of fuel intensive industries, it seems like, businesses and the people within businesses aren't necessarily making sort of energy or fuel efficient decisions. So that's kind of been a lot of focus on my research over the last 5 years is trying to understand, why aren't businesses making, fuel efficient decisions? And then, as Tara was saying, how can we design randomized control trials or field experiments with various companies or organizations in these markets and see, can we move the needle on fuel efficiency, and does that have an impact on productivity? So from a very sort of 40,000 foot approach, pardon the pun on the aviation side, but like in any industry, and there's a lot of industrial organization economists that have studied this. If you look at like the bottom decile companies, and you compare their productivity to the top decile companies in any market, and this could be concrete making, it could be very like homogeneous market, we find that there's a 3x difference in the productivity between the bottom decile and the top decile in most markets. It's quite like a really interesting fact in IO, industrial organization. So what we are trying to understand is like, if we can move companies to be more productive, can we actually get them to be more than energy efficient? So in terms of trying to understand like what causes this 3x difference between the bottom decile and the top decile, and obviously there's a huge amount of research in this area, a lot focused on like capital and labor. But I think the emerging research of the last 10 years is making the case for how management and management practices can really impact on the productivity. So you have the work by Nick Bloom, John Van Reenen, Raphael Sedun over the last 15 years that have shown that maybe management practices can explain a lot of this variation. So that's kind of like been my interest, is how do management and management practices can impact on the productivity in fuel intensive industries. So the first one we looked at was aviation. And we partnered with Virgin Atlantic Airlines back in 2013 and 14 to be able to understand, could we change the management practices of the company with respect to how captains engage with the company. So we identified a few behaviors that actually captains do. So for example, on the bottom left, we have discretionary fuel load. So before takeoff, in many European carriers, the captain is given autonomy or discretion about sort of the remaining fuel being placed onto a plane. And we noticed that there was inefficient decisions being made on that behavior. And then we have like how they take off. So you should have continuous ascent, continuous descent. You should follow the flight plan. And then when you hit the ground, after the engines have cooled down, you should turn off at least one of your engines. And these are things that like captains do well in the simulator, but like actually how they behave and how they do their job, as they are flying, we didn't really know much about their inefficiencies. With respect to fuel, they are compared to on-time efficiency, but nothing about fuel. So we wanted to understand this. So we actually designed an experiment, a randomized control trial with Virgin Atlantic, where we identified these three behaviors, discretionary fuel load, efficient flight, and reduced engine taxiing to turn your engines off. And we randomized like different layers of management practices. So the first one was like information, telling them just what they've done on these three behaviors. They hadn't had this, information before. So this is quite interesting for them because they're like, wow, like I didn't know that you kept a log of this data and this information. So we randomized some groups some captains to receive this information. The second group had individual targets in addition to the information. And then the third treatment group had the same information, the same targets, and then we leveraged pro-social incentives. So we said, hey, we will donate to the charity of your choice if you hit those targets. And we did that for the whole entire captain base of Virgin Atlantic, which is just over 330 captains. And we posted these letters that we designed from scratch to these captains for 8 months. And what we found is that in that 8 months, as we increased the intensity of these management practices for these captains, again, this was randomized, it led to about $6 million of fuel savings. That led to, actually fuel cuts. And so that led to a reduction in CO2 emissions of about 24,000 tons. And then importantly for Virgin Atlantic, it led to higher job satisfaction for the airline captains. So you had like this perfect trifecta where they save money, they saved CO2 emissions, and they made their employees better off. So this is a study from me who was saying, well, maybe there are $20 bills on the sidewalk these companies are not picking up. And only if we could do field experiments and randomized controlled trials to work with companies, we can identify these margins or these inefficiencies and also help the environment at the same time. So we published that paper. So I worked with John List and Ria Gosnell on that project. We published that two years ago, and you can find that paper online, ungated if you want to. But it really did open up my eyes of like, yeah, like management practices. This is the first attempt that we had. We didn't think it would be this successful. And so we were kind of figuring out, okay, are there other industries we want to go after? And then I learned about, shipping captains have probably more discretion about how they navigate various behaviors during the day and the course of a journey, maybe more so than aviation. And shipping has as much, maybe now more emissions, greenhouse gas emissions than the aviation sector. So what we were thinking about is, could we actually understand what are the behaviors that the captains of a ship might do that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, have negative abatement costs, so the benefits outweigh the costs in terms of the emissions reduction, and then could they actually pick up $20 bills on the sidewalk by this and improve their profits. So before we got into this, there's been some work being done by a few consultancies on what are the ways in which shipping captains can change their behavior. So this is by UMass, like a maritime consulting organization. And they've got data from a few companies, shipping companies, and looked at, okay, what margins could a shipping company work on that are like technical, so they're all about the technology, versus operational. So like route optimization can get about 3 to 7% reductions in fuel use. You could have cargo space utilization, which is like how you put the cargo on the ship actually matters to the efficiency of which it glides through the water. That can get up to like 24% fuel efficiency, which is huge. And then you've got like speed reduction, trim optimization. All these things actually lead up to potentially large savings. So we were excited about this. And so I partnered with BSM, which is based in Hamburg, and a technology company, Signal, which comes out of the work we did with Virgin Atlantic, to understand, like, are there really gains that we could have by doing a field experiment with BSM captains to see how we can change these behaviors. And JPEL has funded this research. Well, we're still in the middle of this research. I don't have any results to show. I think what's really exciting is, even before doing the field experiment, we were able to get all of the data on fuel for each ship for every day for the last couple of years, and we know exactly what the weather is about that on that day. We know what vessel they're on. We know what chief engineer is working. We even know what chef is working, and then we can say, okay, can a captain explain some of the variation in the fuel use that we see? And so that will help us give us an upper bound of where we think, when we do the field experiment, we can actually get to that number. So we ran our regression where we were able to see sort of control for the captain and fixed effects and see how that explains variation in fuel use. And we showed that the captain and the chief engineer can explain about sort of 10 to 12% of the variation in fuel use in the shipping industry. And for us, that was really exciting, because now we have this 10 to 12% upper bound, and we are now partnering with Signal, which is a software as a service company that's sort of taken the work we did at Virgin Atlantic and made it into an actual platform. Rather than us, the researchers, sending letters out to the captains, they now have an app. They now have a website. You have emails and you have letters being sent out. And so what we're doing right now is we are randomizing this sort of different levels of feedback, different levels of incentives across BSM captains to understand how we can change those behaviors, like how well they use their trim on the boat, their sort of route optimization, how fast they're going, and the other sort of smaller behaviors that are impacting on fuel efficiency. I should say that, there are many things on this app that we could change. So we can change the targets, we can change sort of how salient the messages are. We can, give them different levels of feedback in different intervals. We can give them a whole host of information on this platform. And then also predict, which ships or which days do we think we're going to get fuel inefficiency, because we got a machine learning algorithm to predict that, and then randomize different ways to provide information to the captains to actually improve their fuel use. So there's a lot of, different ways that we can experiment. You could run a field experiment on our randomized control trial on each of these things. And so that's really exciting. So this is definitely our first dip into the water in the maritime industry, but I think there's huge gains to be had in terms of not just the environment, but the private sector picking up $20 bills on the sidewalk at the same time. And I think that's where we're doing the work right now. And I thank you to Claire and for Tara for supporting this work. But it takes a village to do this type of field experiments. And so, we have these partners like Virgin Atlantic, Signal, and BSM that have understood why doing randomized control trials are important, and partnering with an academic to help them understand how to do a field experiment, how to bring in these certain management practices, and how that can actually help the environment. So thank you everyone for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions at the end.
Thank you, Rob, for that presentation. I saw that it already sparked some questions in the Q&A, so I'm looking forward to getting to that. But for right now, I'm really, really excited to hear from Andreas.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tara. Thanks a lot, Claire. I will probably complement what Rob just said, and I'm going to set up a bit of perspective of policymakers now and what they are interested in guiding this transition. And let me share my slide. And I'm going to use the example now of the European transformation and the target of climate neutrality to talk a bit about different parts of the economy, different sectors, different perspectives in terms of these multi-level governance frameworks, how the implementation of policies can be analyzed. And if you look at the structure of the economy and what we are trying to achieve, it's relatively clear that this stretches through all sectors in the economy. So this decarbonization is not something that is only happening in the energy generation sector, but it's actually stretching through all sectors. And Rob has just shown an example from the transportation sector. And there are many examples from buildings. I'm going to show you some in a second, from the industry sector. And of course, there's as well now a lot of discussion about climate neutrality and actually what it means in terms of negative emissions that are necessary to achieve these targets in the long run. So here you see, for example, sectoral targets by from the German Climate Action Act. And you see that, well, if you look at the targets for the different sectors, well, energy is no longer the biggest polluter. It's actually the industry sector. And you see that there are some emissions that are very, very difficult to reduce, like in the transport sector, but as well in buildings. And there we really face tough challenges where, let's say, what the economists usually ask for, price-based incentives, are very often very difficult to implement because it's addressing very directly the lifestyles of peoples and very difficult to implement politically. And then if you think about what are these different areas where we can do research, it's really interesting to have a short look at something like the climate neutral Germany in 2045, because there you see all these different elements, from negative emissions and how you're actually developing these technologies and scaling them up and making them a technological option in large scale, to issues of modal shift in the transport sector. How can we get people now to move away from cars to use public transport, to really help reduce air pollution and congestion in Europe, which is a major issue. Tara just talked about it for the French example. And that is not all, because we also have to think about energy efficiency. That is what we have done in the past. Why are people not picking up many of the measures and opportunities and programs that are available to them? Why don't we see a large rollout of renewables? Because there's a lot of public resistance on the local level. And of course, then question of how can we make this more acceptable. So the bottom line is, I think that if this would all be a technological challenge, then I guess the idea in Germany is that German engineers would have solved it probably 10 years ago. But it's not. No, it's not a technological issue as such, but it is a societal challenge where you need to involve all these different stakeholders, and you as well need to take into account all these different perspectives on the transformation. And this is a bit the picture that we try to draw as well for the German government. So we are here in a commission that is following the energy transition, and in this commission we are making a yearly evaluation of the status of the German Energiewende and where are the big challenges. And as I said here, the government is very interested exactly on these questions: what works and what does not work, how can we get evidence-based policies in place, and why is it not only financial incentives that count and cannot explain what is actually happening on the ground. We have sandboxes that actually try to formalize this way of moving ahead in the energy transition. And we have a lot of different stakeholders that are involved. Rob talked about the firms that are, of course, all now setting their own climate neutrality targets and really think about how they can become climate neutral and how can they really build up business models that work in these climate neutrality, as well as, of course, households that Tara has shown that are very aware of climate issues. And of course, this issue of climate neutral business cases very often is something that is at odds with current regulation. Many of these things are not really fitting into the current market framework. So there's a clear possibility to think about what works and what does not work for future regulation and future market designs that we expect to be implemented soon. And of course, this is a matter of mixing different policy instruments. And here you see for the residential sector, just a large-scale evaluation of the literature that we did last year on different interventions that can be used. And let's say, of course, the monetary incentives actually works very well in most of the published literature. But interestingly, it's rather important how you combine these different interventions in order to build, effective emission reductions. And you can include then other interventions like information, like feedback, social comparison, motivation. Rob has shown already now a large array of different opportunities in order to improve the effectiveness of your interventions, and have not only the prices tell you the environmental truth, but as well bring in people. And there are a lot of examples for that. For example, here in the framework of smart homes and energy conservation, we have a standing problem of, for example, rolling out smart meters in Germany. It's probably a bit embarrassing how little smart meter rollout we are facing compared to other countries. And that's, of course, detrimental, because that means we cannot design our energy markets as we would like. And for example, we have done analysis on what really works for this rollout. How should we address people? Is it the monetary self-interest? Is it the environmental benefit? Is it some notion of progressiveness, or some legal requirements that have to be fulfilled in order to roll out, for example, smart meters, help building smart homes in Europe? And indeed, here in this example, it was the self-interested that worked best, better than all the other things. We as well looked at other possibilities of intervention, like, for example, goal setting. We know that these non-monetary incentives are effective, but very often the question is how we can scale this, because very often these interventions are very small, very often very individually tailored to circumstances, and it's really unclear how they are scaling. So what we try to do, for example, in these experiments, we try to cooperate with large-scale public utilities in Germany, as well in the other paper, to see how we can actually roll out here incentives like goal setting in a randomized goal setting nudge trial, using really large and different financial incentives in order to allow people to make their own goals, and as well follow up on these goals later on. And we were then signaling them whether they are achieving their goal, whether they are failing. And the bottom line was that we don't find any significant effects of this goal setting on their energy consumption. And that's another interesting point, which I think is really important for this RCT, because in our case, we could show that we have actually attracted what I call energy nerds, so people that are really very engaged, with the climate issue, and they have already relatively optimized energy consumption patterns, and they have invested already in good appliances and in good practices. So no wonder that our app has actually not worked well, and we were not having any effect of this intervention, which as well directs, of course, to an important issue, which is targeting of interventions, and how can we really, bring people on board that are more difficult to address with many of these interventions, but as well where the gains of bringing them in are highest, obviously. And I think this is something where we can learn a lot from these RCTs. And that is especially true if you look at local communities, cities, municipalities. And this is just probably my last slide, where I wanted to convince you that these communities, these cities, they really play an important role, and that was what I just said about the multi-level governance. So it's not only the federal level or the sub-federal level, it's also the local level where these things have to work. They have to be embedded in special circumstances, and there's a lot of activities ongoing. We just finished a project for the German Ministry of research, where we looked at the role of cities and the role of non-governmental actors in general. Also for them, this is a very interesting field of research because they are eager in leading climate protection. So usually they want to lead by example. They think they are strategic leaders, and they almost all have nowadays climate protection concepts in Germany. They have targets, they have very often budgets, they have CO2 accounting in the communities, and they are of course interested in what should we do best in order to really incentivize, motivate our citizens in terms of climate-friendly behavior, and especially then in sectors that are very local, like for example mobility, which is something where these transformation happens in municipalities and cities, and they can actually do quite a lot and can team up here with researchers. So as you can see from this short description, there are many areas where the methodology that have been introduced by Tara, Claire, and Robert can be applied. I think we see that this is happening more and more as well in Europe. There is, I think, traditionally, in many cases, not such a good, let's say, interrelation between businesses, municipalities, and researchers in Europe historically, but it's clear that we have to work together in order to see what really works, and this is a big motivation as well, I think, for the researchers involved in this area. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for that, Andreas. And as also in your presentation, I see that really the Q&A is active. We are also really well on time, so I'm just going to pull up some questions. Andreas, you can stop screen share if you'd like. Okay, so I'll start from the top. This is for Rob. How were the captains motivated to change their behavior? Were there incentives involved? Good question.
Yeah, so in the aviation sector, especially when we did the experiment back in 2014, 2015, prior to our intervention and the field experiment, the captains were given a flat wage rate, so they're not given like any incentives for performing well, either whether it be fuel efficiency or whether it be on-time performance. The airlines were incentivized for on-time performance by regulators at various airports, and they have their own incentives to reduce fuel use because that obviously impacts on the operating costs. But the incentives never got down to the captains. And so that's why we were interested, because these captains, because they weren't incentivized, they never had any information given to them in terms of like how well they performed. And so this information that we were given, which had like, recognition for performing well, like captains had never received that before. So their motivations to do good work before was just pretty much like, how can I get to A to B in the quickest time possible so I can get home? Like that's what they were trying to maximize, is to get safely from A to B, but do it in a way that I can get home quicker than I can. So that was that was their motivator. And then once we brought on the field experiment and then we randomized these different practices across them, I think then these practices became motivations. It was like, okay, like how can I actually hit my target per month? We did have a treatment group that had pro-social incentives. So we said, hey, we will donate to the charity of your choice about £10 per month per target. And that seemed to have a little bit of an extra impact. But where it really hit in terms of a good way to the captains is that led to a significant increase in job satisfaction. And I think given that like pro-social motivations are an important consideration for where people work and how they work, this might be like a good way to retain good staff and good captains. And so because of certain constraints in the aviation sector, like the inability to have performance-related pay for unionization, their motivations before were just individual, and now we change them to be more in line with what the company wanted.
Thanks for that, Rob. I'm going to switch it up now for Andreas. There's a question on interventions for reduced household energy consumption. To what extent are the positive effects robust in the long term? And is there any way to ensure that the behavioral change is persistent?
Yeah, well, the results I showed were actually null results, no? So they were not even effective there. And I think that's as well an important observation, because one of the things I think are very valuable is also redoing things in Europe, which we thought we have already solved in the literature, because Europe is not the US, and some of these things work here probably different than they work in the US. And this is a good example, because I think part of the story I was telling was energy literacy. And I guess this is in general different in the US than it is in Germany, for example. I mean, people have different appliance stocks, now they have different knowledge and so forth, which means some of these things just do not translate easily one-to-one. No? So some information campaign might work in the US, it might work in one place, but it is probably not working in another place. And so therefore, I think that it's really worthwhile also to do replications of things that we might have already seen in the literature, but we want to study the effectiveness in the local context. And we as well have to think about how we can extend as well indeed the timelines of these interventions, because very often these things are just too short-sighted in a way where, and most of these longer-term effects are not taken into account. And I think that's as well important to highlight in these type of cooperations, that we are interested in the long-term effects, and we really would like to observe them. And it's not only about having a 2-year budget that's available and then we are gone, but it's really about thinking a little bit in longer time spans and sticking around for some longer time, or at least coming back at some point in time. And this is part of the story.
Thanks for that, Andreas. Now back to Rob. Another question for you. How did you balance rigorous research with somewhat more speedy demand from most private sector actors? Did you have to sacrifice rigor, or were these specific actors just happy with long timelines to allow for the research part?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it relates to what Andreas just talked about as well on the persistence. So with the Virgin Atlantic study, we actually did want it to both parties, the researchers and the company, did want it to go beyond just a very short-term study. So we wanted to see, we left it go for 8 months. And I think that was just like a nice compromise between everyone, in the sense of they wanted to learn like how long these effects could last for, and if they do persist. And so what actually happened is we ran that for 8 months, and then we stopped. And then we did the analysis to say, whether it worked or not, and then write a paper. In economics, that could take a bit long than other areas. But we did that, and then we fed that research back to Virgin Atlantic, and then they realized, wow, this is having such a good impact on not just fuel efficiency, but also the job satisfaction of the airline captains. And so now they are doing what we did, but doing it through Signal, which is a company that makes what we did very redundant into the technology, but now they have a platform, they have an app, they do all the types of communication to improve the performance for Virgin. So I think there's always like this it's like seeming tension between like what researchers want and what the private sector want. But I think there are people in the private sector that want to know, do these effects last? And if we remove the intervention, do they go back to the baseline? And that's what happened in Virgin Atlantic. So that's why they wanted to actually keep going once they find out the results of the study. So, there might be perception of attention, but I think, in my experience, you do find people in private organizations that want to know, like, is this a beyond a 1 week or a 2 week effect? Does it last for 6 months or 12 months? And I think, finding those right people in the organizations is pretty important for the success of doing like a long-term study.
Thanks for that, Rob. I think we can do one more question per speaker. So Andreas, for you, is the public sector as interested in becoming more effective as the private sector, or much more risk averse?
Well, I guess the general view as somebody working on policy advising is they are not as strict, I would say, in Germany as the private sector. So very often we are not very good in really thinking rigorously about impacts of policies and doing rigorous cost-benefit analysis and really thinking about evidence. But this is changing. So I think it's changing on the one hand because of the availability of these methodologies. So really getting policymakers interested in being able to look at effectiveness. And I think it's as well a necessity because we learned in the last 1 or 2 decades that many things failed. And I think that as well worried policymakers because they are spending a lot of money of things that turn out to be not really effective. And I think there is as well a change of perspective. And this is, I think, an important momentum as well for this type of research.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one last question. For Rob, where do you think behavioral interventions still have huge untapped potential in terms of large-scale mitigation? It's a big question.
Yes, it's a big question. So I think, like, how I'd answer that is, that first statistic that I put up, that moving from the bottom decile to the top decile are productive firms in a market, even like a homogeneous good market, you get a 3x difference in productivity. And so I'm doing work right now in like the retail sector and seeing how like impactful managers are on sort of the energy efficiency in the retail sector. And again, like managers have an impact. And then we are figuring out, like, is there some characteristics about why some managers are good and why some managers are bad for energy efficiency? And it seems like, the managers that are good on like labor productivity are also good on energy efficiency productivity. So I think, like, trying to figure out, I don't actually know where the low-hanging fruit is, but I think in every market, there's going to be $20 bills on the sidewalk in terms of improving the profits for the company and at the same time having energy efficiency benefits. So I think, like, I don't know which market I'm going to look at next, but definitely in the aviation, maritime, and retail, we're seeing similar results. That as you get the firms to be a bit more productive, you also get them to be better for the environment, and you might have benefits for the employees as well. And so only through doing the field experiments can we work that out. And we need to have the partnerships with private organizations. And so, coming back to the question that Andreas just had, there are starting to be changes in how regulators think about evidence in these markets. So, for example, in the UK, the Office for Gas, Electricity Markets, Ofgem, like, they are working with the energy companies and academics to run experiments to understand how to improve the marketplace. So is Ofcom in the UK. In the US, you have public utilities commissions that want to have experimental evidence to show whether a behavioral program worked or not. So, like, as Andreas said, like, it's starting to change. Like, regulators and policymakers are seeing why you need to run randomized controlled trials, and they're not making it difficult for us. They're actually saying, okay, for academics, like, why don't we all partner together with companies in a market and see how we can actually make consumers better off. And like, if that's a model for the future, I think it's going to be great for everyone.
Thanks, Rob. What a nice way to end the Q&A. As promised, I'm just going to pull up another screen on how we can partner. Great. Quick check if you can see my screen. Great. Yes, so thank you again to our speakers and to the audience for asking these really good questions. As promised, here's the partnership timeline once more. So ideally, I would love to hear from you immediately and explore a possible collaboration as soon as possible. By around mid-March, I would then match you to researchers in our network, and you can flesh out these evaluation ideas. And over the summer, the expression of interest portal is open, where researchers will map out the project ideas and then submit it to K-CAI. But just to note, the expression of interest is a really short submission, and it's really just to check the eligibility of this idea, and it's really to give K-CAI a first glimpse of what you want to evaluate and how you think it could work. And then at the end of September, the portal opens for full proposals and closes again in mid-October. And that's where the deliberation starts. And after the board reviews these proposals, you or the researcher will hear back with a final verdict on funding around mid-December. So the dates aren't set in stone yet, but that's kind of a rough timeline. And from my side, thank you so much for your time and interest in evidence for climate action in Europe. We hope to have sparked a conversation about the role of evidence in climate action, and look forward to hearing from you. So here you can see my email. Please get in touch. I love talking about this, and I'd be happy to explore some ideas that you might have and provide more information on how we can work together. So thank you so much, and goodbye.